It's a great environment for doing business. This is the time to realistically think about growth, to raise expectations. But it can't just be you raising the expectations and thinking about growth. You've got to bring the salespeople along. So you need to train, and coach.
Hello and welcome to the Industrial Growth Institute podcast. Sincere thank you to everyone on the growing list of folks who take time to listen and watch these episodes every week. We're all overcommitted, and I know when you decide to invest time with me and my guests, that's a meaningful commitment. And I try to honor that with the quality of guests and conversations. And today, I think you'll find I absolutely have. We're joined by a Hall of Famer. Dave Kurlan was inducted into the Sales and Marketing Hall of Fame in 2012. And, that's not by chance. That was not just some honorific. I'm only going to share a couple of his credentials. You'll learn more through our conversation. Dave was a phenomenally successful Sandler training franchisee until he decided to found Kurlan and Associates in 1985. He's a frequent speaker and radio guest. He wrote the best-selling book, Baseline Selling, and he founded the Objective Management Group, the industry leader in sales assessments and Salesforce evaluations. In addition to being a sales legend, he's also incredibly focused and driven and very analytical, attributes that maybe counterintuitively to some, but I think obviously contribute to a sales success, but also in other areas of his life that we're gonna touch on. So as you listen or watch, please by all means jump in, leave a comment, be sure to share the episode with folks who might benefit, like it, and do the subscription drill if you would, please hit the bell. So help me to welcome Dave Kurlan. Dave, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure to be here, Ed, and thanks for thinking of me and inviting me to join you today.
You've been on the list for a long time. I wanted to make sure I built a solid
That sounds
base.
like a bad thing.
Well, we can figure that out as we go through, I guess.
Making our lists and checking them twice. Sounds like you checked it more than twice.
So you've got a lot of passions, obviously sales, but baseball and music in addition to sales. How did you end up with the career in sales?
Very much not on purpose. The day that I became a professional salesperson, I was flunking out of college. It was semester 1. I was 11th in my class from the bottom. It was clear to me that the goal my father had for me, which was to join him in his optometric practice, was not going to happen. I was never going to make it to optometry school. I had a 0.79 GPA. And not because I was dumb, but because I didn't know how to study. I hadn't yet figured out or understood that I was a visual learner. And I was trying to learn everything auditorily, and it didn't work. So I didn't comprehend what I was hearing. I didn't comprehend what I was reading. So I needed to find a job to justify continuing to live on Earth. And I went on interviews for everything that I was qualified for, which was nothing.
Short list.
And I ended up in a Cutco knife office, in a Cutco knife recruiting situation. And the very last thing that we were asked to do was turn the application over and indicate whether we thought we could do this job and why. So that was easy. I wrote no, because I don't talk to people. I'm an introvert. This is not who I am. It would be against my nature. And the last thing in the world I could see myself doing was selling anything. No brainer. Now, despite having written that, I had already sold greeting cards and soap and landscaping services because I'm an entrepreneur at heart. So I'd been doing this stuff right along without ever thinking that I was selling. It was just doing stuff to make money. And so I walked out the door feeling good about my emphatic decision. And it was one of the first supernatural experiences that I had in my life, where I was forced to turn around, walk back in, do the most uncomfortable thing in the world for me, and say, you know what? I need to do this. And of course, they would have taken anybody. I didn't know that then, but
Right.
because I was later doing those recruiting classes, and let's take anybody who will do it. But it was an incredible life changing moment for me because it forced me onto the God chosen path that I had, so that I would eventually get to here. So that's how it
You know,
started.
Cutco knives and network marketing really, a lot of people are very critical of them. They get a bad rap, but it's amazing to me how many really strong salespeople I hear anecdotally had some Cutco knife experience early in their career.
Well, it's interesting. The model is churn.
Right.
Period. Just churn. Get all these college kids, let them sell their family and friends, and then when
Right.
they run out of family and friends, we'll get another college kid to do the same thing. And I was one of those college kids. Um, and I churned through all the family and friends. And while the average sale back then, this was 1973, 1974, the average sale was around $150. My average sale was 10, because people were making pity purchases. And I'm like, oh, we can't let this poor kid leave without anything. So they all bought the least expensive knife in the package, a knife, not a
Right.
set of knives, not a set of steak knives, a little knife. And so I got to that turning point where I could churn like everybody before me and everybody ahead of me. Or again, I could do what was uncomfortable and start making cold calls. And I chose to stick it out and start making cold calls. And it was the most horrible thing in the world. I mean, I was somebody who was afraid of people, and now I'm knocking on doors. It wasn't even modern day cold calling where you're picking up a phone and dialing. It was literally banging on doors. And real early on, I recognized that the only way I was going to survive this 8 hours of cold calling was to make it 1 hour of cold calling. And to go from 8 hours, an entire day of banging on doors, to 1 hour, I had to get really good at targeting. Who was I really going after? Who were the people who actually bought these things? And then I had to get really good at it, so that when somebody was home and answered the door, I could turn that either into, oh yeah, there's a single girl who works for the phone company living right across the street, or oh, my daughter uh, works as a nurse. And so I got so good at that and getting referrals and introductions, so that I really compressed the prospecting time down into something that was manageable and doable for me. So I was spending most of my time running 3 appointments a day or a night, instead of killing myself banging on doors. And
So I was gonna
that's
I
been
was
a
gonna ask
theme
what kind
of
of. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
that's been a theme of my career: efficiency. How do you make selling efficient? Even though that was a B2C experience, and my next experience was B2C, 99.9% of our clients over the last almost 40 years have been B2B.
I was gonna ask what that kind of B2C sales teaches you that's applicable to B2B, but I think you've answered that question. Um, did you figure that out on your own to get better and to get more efficient, or did you have a mentor or somebody that was teaching you?
There was a guy. I figured a lot of stuff out on my own, but there was a guy, his name was Bob Jagir. He was then probably my age now. And he was an old school, wherever aluminum, pot and pan sales champion, number one sales guy in the country. And he was running the New England division for Cutco and wherever. And he took me under his wing after I'd been figuring it out for probably a year. And he taught me what selling was. He was way ahead of his time. He was selling consultatively before there was consultative selling. He was selling based on building a relationship before there was relationship selling. And basically, his model was about smiling and taking his glasses off and taking a step back while everybody else was sticking a foot in the door and being aggressive. And he made it, our target audience back in 1974 was an 18 to 25-year-old single working female. And he made sure mom was there, and he made sure that he barely looked at her daughter, and the whole interaction was between him and mom. And he did a lot of upfront qualifying, and he did a whole lot of upfront rhetorical questioning, and he got them all always to the point where they were going to buy whatever it was he had in that box that he didn't open.
Hmm.
It happened to be beautiful, incredible, sharp knives, but uh, if it had been flatware or china or pots and pans or kitchen cabinets or fences, they would have bought it regardless. And so that was
Did
that
he
was
see
my
something in
early
you?
mentorship. I'm
Did
sorry.
he pick you out of the crowd because he saw something in you, or did you pick him out? Did you just glue yourself to him, believing that he was the one that was going to be able to make you successful?
This was pretty easy. Everybody failed in that business, and I hadn't failed out yet. So I was the one with potential. And at
Got it.
18 years old, going on 19 years old at that point, I looked 12, and I was just this little introverted kid who was trying to come out of his shell. And he grabbed me, and he spent the good part of a year with me, just trailing him. He brought me to
Wow.
his house. He cooked me lunch. He cooked me dinner. He taught life lessons. He brought me on calls. He watched me on calls. He didn't let me out of his sight. And he turned me into a salesperson. Now, I learned a lot more after him. I learned a lot more when I got into my next business, and by the time I started Kurlan in 1985, that's incredible. We're coming up on 40 years.
Wow.
Um, by the time I got to here, I really had a good grasp of what it took to succeed in selling, and more importantly, what it took to succeed at sales management and sales leadership, which is something I was sorely missing in those Cutco days. Because I became a sales manager 5 months in. I was 18 years old, and my model that I was taught on was churn.
Hmm.
Recruit, 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 recruit. Let them sell their friends and family, and recruit some more.
Right.
And I felt that that was a wasted effort. I thought that was inefficient. So my goal was to get people to stay and get them to do what I did. And I actually had some success at that. I got people to stay. I got people to produce past the point of friends and family. But the company didn't like that. They made money on recruit, 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 because with every recruit came a sample kit that they made money
Right.
on. And so that was steady income for the company. So while my sales were always in the top 10 for the United States of America, and my team was always in the top 10 for the United States of America, and I thought I was doing great. They thought I was doing crappy because my recruiting numbers were down.
Hmm.
So, being a good company boy at that point, I got my recruiting numbers up. Sales went down, but they were happy.
Wow. Would you recommend that a college kid jump into an experience with Cutco or some other kind of a sales job just to build some understanding of sales early in their career?
Yes, absolutely. It's a great experience, whether you succeed at it or fail outright at it. Just having to learn a presentation and get yourself in front of people, especially college kids today, they talk with their thumbs. They don't
Right.
really have face to face interactions. They don't know how. They aren't good at it. So it forces them to look adults in the eye and have a conversation and be persuasive. So, if for no other reason than to experience it, yeah, they should do it,
Right.
even if they're
Yeah.
never going to sell.
Yeah, I think everyone should understand business finance and understand how to sell, regardless of what role they're
Absolutely.
in.
Finance is so important. When we're training and coaching salespeople to sell to a top executive in a company, whether it's a CEO or a CFO or a CRO or a VP of something, if they
Right.
can't talk finances, which are the always some part of the underlying reason why someone will buy from them, then they
Sure.
can't effectively sell to top leadership.
Right. All right. Baseball. Talk about your
Like
baseball playing
baseball.
days.
What do you want
What
to know?
position? What position
Me,
did you play?
I played third base.
Okay.
And this is
And
this is just like the selling experience. Like I was an all-star in Little League, and then we graduate to the big diamond, and I was so tiny I couldn't reach first base with my throw. I couldn't throw the ball across the diamond. And when I got up to the plate, I couldn't hit the ball out of the infield. I was not near big enough or strong enough. So I couldn't play baseball after Little League. So I took, oh, 10 years off and then started playing in a beer league softball league. And that sucked. I hated softball. I couldn't hit softball. And then the senior men's baseball league came to central Massachusetts. And they came up with a really original name. It was called the Central Massachusetts Senior Men's Baseball League. And so I was first to sign up for that. So I rejuvenated and got back into playing men's baseball at the age of 34.
Wow.
And I was still able to play. I won the batting title the first year because now
Was that before or after Red Sox fantasy camp?
I was after. Yeah, because
And this has been an ongoing passion. I mean, you're not in your office today, so we don't have the entire panorama of baseball memorabilia that your impressive collection that's in your office, but you've also spent dedicated years of your life along with your wife to your son Michael's baseball career and attending every game, and you've written articles about how many games that means in retrospect you've actually attended. So obviously baseball is a real passion of yours.
you might be overstating the articles I've written about baseball and him because I've written 2,000 articles and only 100 of them have been about his baseball and how that relates to selling. And there's always uh, an analogy from baseball to selling. I continue to come up with new analogies from baseball to selling. It's awesome when you can combine your life passion with your work passion and put them together and come up with something that works for people.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things, let me pull it out here, we're going to come to in a little while is that ultimate combination, your baseline selling methodology and book that tie them together. But before we get there, one more detour along the way. So we've heard about how you started in sales. We heard about baseball. How about music?
I was a trumpet
What
player.
could you have made a living doing that?
I don't think so. I mean, I was
No.
making a living doing that. I played professionally for 5 years. I had bands starting when I was 15 years old. So I had my own bands, three different bands, over 15 years. I quit playing professionally um, when I was around 25. Um, and I was in the music business. I had a retail music business for 10 years. And during the 10 years in that retail business, I learned to play every freaking instrument there was, enough so I could fool you for a minute. So, trumpet was my main instrument. I played bass guitar in my wedding band.
Well,
And I made a living in that wedding band. That was 3 to 4 gigs a weekend, and we got fed chicken dinner at every one of them. So, uh, and the first instrument I played was piano, so I can still play some piano. But there's an interesting music thing too, because I, as I mentioned earlier, with my struggle studying, I discovered that I was a visual learner, and most good musicians can play by ear, and I couldn't.
hmm.
I couldn't do anything by ear. I hadn't developed my auditory skills. But if you threw a piece of sheet music in front of me, didn't matter what was on it, I could read sheet music better than anybody. So I could have been a studio musician. Go in the studio, here's the chart, play it. Um, so I I gave up music professionally and started in the sales training business and the sales coaching business. And as you know, and as you help companies to know, the key is listening and asking questions. So to be really good at coaching salespeople, I had to listen like crazy and I had to develop my active listening skills. And I've probably got active listening skills that are as good as anybody on the planet. I know watching all those interviews that have been on the air for the last year with presidential candidates and surrogates, how bad most of those interviewers are because they're constantly letting stuff go by that would be really fertile for great follow-up questions, and the interviewers miss them. But I picked them up. And so the interesting thing, I don't want to beat this horse to death. But when I went back to playing the trumpet and the piano 5 years after I'd been in the business, suddenly, magically, I could play by ear. I hadn't practiced
And
any music for 5 years. And all of a sudden, because I had developed my active listening skills, I could hear the intervals and the notes, and I didn't need the sheet music anymore. It was magic.
were you playing improvisationally, or was it all according to the sheet
Both.
music?
I wasn't playing in a band at this point. I would just go sit at the piano and pound something out, or pick up the trumpet and pound something out. And I didn't have to put a piece of sheet music in front of me anymore. So
Hmm.
that just emphasizes how crucial it is to develop listening skills.
Right. Well, I listened to what you said about listening to the political interviews, but I'm not going to take the bait. We're not going to wander into that discussion today. We got other stuff we could talk about.
Aw,
Um,
shucks.
one final music question: are you a vinyl purist, or how about MP3s?
Um, I am not a vinyl purist. I know people who are audiophiles who will only listen to vinyl. They're audio snobs and they have sophisticated sound systems. I'm fine with a high quality MP3 in my earbuds or earpods. And I think that sounds pretty freaking good.
Got it. All right. So you've trained thousands of reps. How quickly can you tell if somebody has potential? Not just the one person left standing after everyone else has churned like your mentor did, but if you look at a group, how long does it take you to figure out a new sales team you're talking to whether somebody has potential?
Well, is it, that's a more complex answer than 20 seconds, Ed. Because there's my visual observation, and then there's the analytic data that supports it. So typically, before training a group, we do a professional sales team evaluation, and the results of that evaluation would tell us who's got the incentive to change,
Hmm.
who's coachable, and in which of the 21 sales core competencies they need help. Then there's the actual looking at a group. And I've always known in the first 30 minutes who was going to respond to the training. And there are some kind of hard and fast rules I have about that. For instance, there's always going to be people set in their ways who have been there forever, who dig in their heels and don't want to change. And
Forgotten more about
I,
sales than you're ever going to know.
right. And I think there's a correlation between how they're paid and whether they'll change. That's one of the correlations. The more closely the compensation is aligned with all salary or mostly salary means they don't have a financial benefit to changing.
Right.
And I know from working with salespeople for 40 years that salespeople tend to take the path of least resistance. They're going to do the thing that's familiar. They're going to do the thing that's most comfortable. They're going to do the thing they know. So what we're asking them to do when we're training them is adapt or adopt a sales process that's different from what they've done. And we're going to try to develop their listening and questioning skills. And we're going to teach them to sell value the right way and qualify the right way. And so that would not be a path of least resistance. That would be an uncomfortable thing to do. So if they don't have the monetary incentive to change and they don't have a growth mindset incentive to change, and they've been around a long time and they're set in their ways and comfortable, and there's a word for this that I can't think of. It's I'm sorry, this is my 69-year-old mind glitching, but I hear it all complacent. That's
Right.
the most common complaint sales leaders and CEOs have about the sales team. Well, Dave, candidly, I think the team's complacent. But there's a reason for complacency. Complacency is a symptom of something. They haven't been
Maybe
challenged.
complacent management.
Nobody nobody has made growth in revenue or new account acquisition a condition of continued employment. So without that condition of continued employment, we have the sales equivalent of a country club. You
Right.
basically stay a member as long as you want to stay a member, and no one's going to kick you out unless you break the rules.
Right.
And that's the bigger challenge when it comes to training and developing salespeople than whether the skills are present or not.
How about the question of sales as a natural, what's the right way to say it? There's this idea among some that you're born a salesperson. One of the things I think it's clear from having listened to you over the years is that there's a big difference in what you're selling. If you're selling ERP software to a $1 billion revenue company, that's very different than selling office supplies to a small legal office. The size of the transaction, size of the buying team, length of the sales cycle, the implications of making a mistake, the disruption involved in implementation, all of that is so different that the former sale, that ERP to the $1 billion company, feels to me vastly more difficult and vastly more complex. So I think that you can be a perhaps a very strong salesperson in some situations and just completely inept in others. You agree or disagree?
Oh, totally agree. And you gave a great example. Here's the thing that I'm always pushing back on sales leaders on. We've got a great candidate. Oh, good. What makes him great? Well, he was the number one salesperson where he came from. Out of how many? Oh, I didn't ask. Well, there's a difference between being number one out of three and being number one out of 200. We
Right.
should find out. Now, what was he selling? Um, Fasteners. Okay. Who is he selling it to? Buyers, procurement. Okay. Now, who do you need him to sell to? VPs of manufacturing, VPs of engineering, VPs of design. Okay. And what do you need him to sell? Capital equipment. Okay, so let's pretend this was the number one salesperson, not only out of 200, but in the entire fastener industry. He was better than anybody at taking orders from procurement. How is that going to serve you if you need him to call on a VP of manufacturing, a VP of engineering, a VP of design, and sell a $500,000 piece of capital equipment? He will fail. He
Right.
he has not sold in that environment, and you don't know if he can. So I'd rather you hire somebody who has already called on those three VPs, has already sold something that costs 6 or 7 figures, and has succeeded doing that, than this person who you really liked, who seems like he'll fit in your culture, but I can predict that there's a 95% chance he will struggle and never make it happen.
And the degree of competition that they face before versus facing your
Yeah.
industry, the uniqueness of your product, whether you're feeding them inbound leads or they have to go out and find all of it themselves, the percent of repeat business that you're comfortable with versus new logos, all of those are that same kind of factor where you need to try to simulate as closely as possible that situation in which they've had success to match it to your situation.
How all those things flew off your tongue, showing that you're a subject matter expertise.
Well, and I credit you for my learnings. So thank you.
Don't need to. You are a subject matter expertise
All right.
expert.
So speaking of subject matter and experts, you founded OMG, the Objective Management Group, and I think I was trying to calculate the number of years. You and I first met in the spring of 1992. So if it's 40 years that Kurlan and Associates been in business, I guess it's 35 years basically that we've known each other. I was applying for a job. I was sent to you for a sales candidate assessment. At the time, you didn't have this fancy online tool. You pulled out a yellow pad and started asking me questions and writing down notes. Over the years, you turned it into a very sophisticated online tool that measures, as you said, 21 sales specific competencies. Almost 3 million reps have taken it. Successful exit a couple of years ago. Did you have that vision from the beginning or did that evolve?
That evolved. At the beginning, I was thinking, hey, maybe we can get a few other sales experts selling this, and maybe we can generate, $100,000, $250,000 in assessment business. I had no idea back then in 1990 that it would become a multi-million dollar company and it would sell for such a multiplier of the revenue that it did, that we'd end up with millions of salespeople and sales executives taking it, whether as part of a sales team evaluation or as part of a candidate assessment, or that we'd have this huge reseller network. And I got to give credit to all the people that made that happen, because my early beliefs didn't support that.
Well, obviously, a lot of thought and rigor and much of your analytic and data kind of centric outlook and personality and approach to business played into that. It's fascinating because not only does it offer predictively accurate, um, information and findings on salespeople within the team as an evaluation of sales candidates, but it also is a very sophisticated tool from the testing perspective. And one of the things that it often gets conflated with is personality and behavioral tests, but they're really quite different. And without getting into ipsative and normative and all other kinds of technical language, explain the difference and how you kind of discovered that.
Sure. Um, I used personality assessments early on. You know, I found that a personality assessment could help me better understand the person I was training or coaching, and I used them. And I would always find something that would be helpful, that would allow me to get more out of that salesperson. But they weren't sales assessments. They were personality. So they talked personality traits, or in the case of a behavioral style assessment, they behavioral tendencies. And it was fine for me developing an understanding of the person or seeing what kind of cultural fit they would be with the company that they were being considered to work for. But it wasn't sales. It didn't come close to sales, and there was no correlation to anything. They weren't predictive. So I decided to develop my own. And yeah, it was pretty primitive at the beginning, but over time, it became very sophisticated, and we finally settled on the fact that it had to be based on sales specific core competencies, and the core competencies changed over time as selling changed over time. And
Right.
over time, we added attributes to each of those competencies, so that at the time of the exit, it was the gold standard for anything sales when it came
Right.
to doing assessments and evaluations and looking at teams and sales management effectiveness. I'm really proud of what we developed.
I love understanding the journey that people took. They have a vision, they create something, and it's always fascinating to me how close their initial vision was to the ultimate product and understanding the pivots and the development and the learnings along the way. Thanks
There's
for
a cool
filling in those
story
pieces.
that kind of supported this. Um, Back in the 80s, uh, I was being asked to train an industrial sales team. So this is your old sweet spot. And the president of the company had a dozen salespeople. And he said to me, before we start the training, he said, I'm a product guy. I'm not a sales guy. I don't know anything about selling other than we need it. But you're a sales guy. I bet that if you interviewed my 12 guys, and I'm not being sexist, they were all guys. If you interviewed my 12 guys, I bet you'd find out that I've probably got two or three that shouldn't even be in sales. And I bet you'll figure out that there's probably another two or three that you're not going to be able to train. And I bet you'll find out that with the six who should be here, that there are specific gaps in their knowledge of selling that you could focus on, and that information would help you be more effective at helping me grow my team's revenue. And I was thinking about that, and half of me's going, yeah, for sure, he's right. The other half was me going, oh, I got to interview 12 guys. That's going to suck. And I'm not doing that for free. That's going to cost them a lot of money. So I said, well, I'll do it, but it's going to cost a lot more than what we originally talked about in terms of the budget required. He said, it'll be worth it. You wait and see. So I interviewed the 12 guys, and he was right conceptually. There were a couple guys there that shouldn't be in sales. There were four guys that I wasn't going to be able to make any better. They just didn't care enough and didn't have the incentive to change. There were about a half a dozen that I thought I could really make some headway with. Thought they had the potential to double, maybe even triple their revenue. So the first thing I learned was that without the two guys who shouldn't be in sales, and without the four guys who we weren't going to be able to train, and focusing just on the six who had the potential and cared, wow, training was easy. There was nobody pushing back. They were just soaking it up and loving it and going out and doing the things we were talking about. So not only was it easier, it went faster. And they excelled at growing revenue more than any team I had trained before that. So that was huge for me. And this is before OMG and before sales assessments. And then I found myself in front of another president of another industrial distribution company, and we're talking about training. And I'm not stupid. So I said, I've learned that if we also interview, this was bigger, you're 20 guys, I'm probably going to find that a small percentage of them shouldn't even be in sales, and a little bigger percentage probably aren't going to benefit from the training. And of the folks who I'm going to be able to help, I'll be able to identify exactly where they need the help because it's going to be different for everybody. And he said, wow, that makes a lot of sense. I said, and I've also learned that when we do it that way, training goes faster, it's more powerful, and the growth is exponential. He said, let's do it. So we did it again, got the same result. So that led to me adopting that process and interviewing everybody. And that started giving me a sense of what the right questions needed to be to get at those basic things. Who should be here? Who's trainable? How much better can they be? And where do they need the help? And that led to a paper assessment which worked. And then that led to people hearing about it and wanting to know if they could use my assessment. That led to the formation of OMG and
Yeah.
formalizing that whole thing.
So that's a journey, similar, I would say, to the journey that you've taken with content marketing. We're going to shift gears a little bit. You were doing content marketing before it had a name, before people were practicing. You've written, what did you say, 2,000 articles? You've made a lot of videos. You run a lot of webinars. What prompted that? I mean, people for the last 10 years, they've had a roadmap to follow. They've seen how it works. You started doing it before any of that was clear.
I had already written Mindless Selling and Baseline Selling. And Vern Harnish, who is the author of Mastering the Rockefeller Habits and Scaling Up, and who's developed two coaching organizations, one called Gazelles and the next called, I think it's Scaling Up. He said or we're friends. And he called me and he said, Dave, you need to write a sales management Bible. I said, you think so? He said, absolutely. He said, business needs a Bible on what are the best practices to be an effective sales manager. And I said, okay. So there was this 2 year period between when baseline selling came out and when I started the writing. And I remembered when I was writing baseline selling, I needed 2 hours a night to get my train of thought onto paper. Um, and I was so busy back then with getting OMG launched, and Kurlan was busy from the success of baseline selling. And I just couldn't find the 2 hours at a time. And I had read about something called a blog. And I'm like, well, that's pretty short form. That's a couple of paragraphs. At least back then, it was a paragraph or two. One of the people who was successfully blogging was Seth Godin, and he rarely wrote more than a paragraph or two. And
Right.
I was thinking, well, I could do that. I mean, how long does it take to write a paragraph or two? 10 minutes. I could do 10 minutes. And maybe if I focus on the sales management stuff that I would later include in a book, I get enough of these mini thoughts together
Right.
and my book will be written. Well, that was how it started. Um, 2,000 articles later, the book never got written because the blog took on a life of its own. And I still don't have the time or the desire to sit and write for 2 hours at a time for a year. But if somebody wanted to, they'd go through the blog and everything they would ever need to know about uh, starting, scaling, leading, managing, motivating, coaching, and holding a sales team accountable is in there. Everything they'd ever need to know about hiring, recruiting, job postings, interviews, onboarding, it's in there, along
Right.
with a whole bunch of good sales content too. So I don't think I'm
That's
ever going
that's
to
what.
write that sales management book.
Well, you probably don't have that much more to write. You've written it all already.
I
Um,
keep finding new things to write about.
well, and new analogies. I mean, you use a lot of analogies, but the discipline to write every week is rare. But you've done it while you were running a training business and starting another business. I'm struck that that discipline is probably common among great athletes and great musicians and great salespeople. Is have you had to actively cultivate it, or was it natural for you?
I think it was natural for me for anything I cared enough about.
Okay.
You know, if we looked at accounting, for example, you're not going to see that kind of discipline as it relates to accounting, or legal or the other functions of the business. But I love the writing. I love recording videos. I love sales process. I love uh, training and coaching, and my brain just works in analogies. Everything is an analogy to selling or leading salespeople. And I see something where other people say, "Oh, what beautiful foliage," and I see a sales article in that.
Right. Your analogies even include physical labor sometimes, out with a chainsaw or out clearing brush or whatever the case may be. And um, I mean, it's relatively rare that people who could afford to pay somebody to come and do that work for them actually do it these days. I do it as well. On the one hand, I guess it's a failure to delegate. Maybe I could use that time and make more money elsewhere. On the other hand, philosophically, it bothers me to just kind of float and have others do the hard work. I think we need to embrace hard work and embrace doing work that's sometimes unpleasant. Is why do you participate in that kind of physical labor?
I don't think labor is that physically intensive because I'll be 70 next year. So I know what I'm capable of at this point, which isn't
Hmm.
much. I can dig holes so that my wife can put in 300 plants every spring. Um, I can take out the weed whacker and keep the property weed free. I'm not going to get on my hands and knees. We have so many square feet. It's probably just unbelievable how many square feet of garden we have. I'm not getting on my knees and pulling weeds by hand. so I'm going to weed whacker it. We've got a huge forest up the hill that we cleared during COVID. My wife and I just took the trees down ourselves.
Well,
So I'm up there with the weed whacker, trying to keep that clear. That's not really physically exhausting stuff, using a weed whacker, using a blower,
right.
even digging the holes for the plants. She's not putting in trees, they're flowers, so I can dig
Hmm.
those holes. And I like doing it. The property looks fantastic when we're done. She's very visual, so she knows what she has to do to make it look a certain way. And
Right.
I'm happy to dig the holes and put the plants in the ground. So
Got it. You've also written some posts with analogies around your faith journey. A lot of people would hesitate to explore religion publicly, or even figure out how to make a connection between religion and sales. But you've done that.
somehow, yes, I have. Part of it is getting to a certain age where you just don't give a fuck anymore what
Right.
anybody thinks. I mean, I going back to 2016, because I've also done a lot of political analogies, and I like using political analogies because everybody sees what's going on. They're
Hmm.
seeing the things that I'm seeing, but I'm pulling something sales out of it. So I know how hateful people can be, because anytime I did a post and it had the word Trump in it, even if it also had the word Obama or Biden or Clinton or anybody else, if it had the word Trump, I'd get hate emails and I'd get hate comments. I expected the same thing would happen the first time I wrote about God being in my life, the first time I wrote about the book proving the existence of Jesus, the first two in what will be a series of articles about the Bible and sales. Um, Interestingly and thankfully, I haven't gotten not one hateful email or comment. Well, yeah, I'm lying. I did. I got one last week. But
Well, I'm heartened to
context,
hear that you had to think that hard about how many you got. I mean, that's good news.
yeah. On the religious stuff, I get mostly thank you for being brave enough to write about this, or thank you for including this. But there was a candidate, I'm helping a client hire a salesperson for a manufacturing sales job. And there was one client that I talked to a couple of weeks ago, and I knew in the first minute that I had him on the phone that he was wrong. He was too
Hmm.
abrasive. He was too arrogant. He was too cocky. He didn't try to make a connection. He was all about him. So that 5 minute phone screen became a 1.5 minute, ended as quick as possible. And the way I end that call, and you probably do the same thing, is say, so here's how I'm going to end this call. If you hear back from me by the end of the day, Friday, we'll schedule an interview with you, a 30-minute interview. But if you don't hear back from by the end of the day, Friday, you didn't make it to the next interview. So this guy didn't hear back from me by the end of the day, Friday, and he wrote me a scathing email about what a fraud I was, what a phony I was, what an imposter I was, what a legend in my own mind I was, and how my posts, my articles on God and the Bible and religion and the analogy to selling are jokes. And then he finished with a whole bunch of slurs, insults. The stuff I said were not the slurs and the insults, those were his opinions. Then came the slurs and the insults and
Wow.
the name calling. And then he asked me if I changed my mind about him to call him.
It sounds like the phone screening worked.
Yeah. I was like, can you imagine letting this guy get through to the client? Oh my God.
Wow. Wow. Uh, Related in some ways to some of these topics is accountability, and you and I have had some exchanges on LinkedIn. Accountability just seems to have evaporated in many ways in business and personal lives, even in the military, which I always used to think was kind of an avatar for accountability. And we see it particularly in sales, where success gets built on the improvement that can only come through serious self-reflection and efforts at self-improvement. What happened? How did we lose accountability?
don't know that we ever had accountability in sales.
Okay.
And I think what happened was people like you and me and the others in our space started talking about the importance of accountability. We started putting metrics in place for accountability. We started having a general understanding of what would be expected in terms of accountability. But most of the people in sales management have never been trained to manage salespeople. Most of the
Right.
people in sales leadership have not been trained to lead a sales team. Most of them have not been coached to get better at this. And the only thing they really have to go on is the modeling that was done on the managers that they reported to, which
Right.
was mostly the managers sold to, and they'd come in to save the day when there was a closable deal. And that's what they understood to be sales management. So what changed was we put a framework together and presented it to people. What didn't change is people still aren't using the framework. I was I was coaching a couple of sales leaders from a client I've had since 2020, and they were complaining that their salespeople aren't doing anything. Like, can we be more specific about who isn't doing what? So the newer salespeople that came in after we had done training weren't doing the prospecting. And I said, okay, so what are you doing about that? And they said, basically nothing. And they were like, how do we fix this? What do we do about it? And I'm like, well, let's go back to the metrics. And I said, what are the metrics that they're expected to meet? And then how are you holding them accountable to those metrics? And they're like, so in the next call, we went right back to the beginning and figured out what the metrics needed to be, what was going to drive revenue, basically what it took on a daily basis to close the number of deals they needed to close every year. And we spent about 45 minutes on that. We came up with the right numbers. And then they said, one of them said, this sounds familiar. I said, of course it sounds familiar, Matt. You went through this training 4 years ago and we did it then. He's like, oh, I guess I never looked at it after that.
Well, can a sales manager build a culture of accountability? If you hire the right person, if you get a real sharp sales manager, train them properly, can they create a culture of accountability on the team if executive leadership lacks accountability and doesn't reinforce that in the culture?
Yeah, with the caveat that it might require hiring a whole new sales team. The people that have been there right along may resist and resent suddenly having to report the number of dial attempts they're making every day, the number of conversations they're having every day, the number of new meetings they're booking every day.
And when they don't
That may
like dad's
cause,
answer, run back to mom to get a different answer.
right. Um, and if they do that, they do that. Uh, but you at least, if executive leadership won't commit to that, they need to at least support that. And if you've got salespeople who won't do that, won't go into CRM every day and keep that up to date, if they're basically bucking the system and they
Right,
aren't outperforming their number, and we know 50 to 60% of them won't outperform their number,
right,
um, then let's replace them and get some people in who are hired with the understanding that you're going to be held accountable, and we're going to come up with the numbers, and we'll mutually agree to those numbers, and then meeting those numbers every day is a condition of continued employment.
right.
And so, yeah, I've had clients and they've had to totally replace sales teams to get to that point. But most companies aren't willing to do that dirty work. They're either afraid of the conversation to terminate somebody. They're afraid to make it a condition of continued employment because maybe that salesperson's going to leave and take all their business with them, which never happens.
Right.
And the devil we know is better than the devil we don't know. So
Yeah,
it's
most are
hard.
so crappy at hiring. There's no point in firing somebody because the likelihood they're going to hire somebody better is quite low.
Exactly. Exactly. So it's not change that comes easy. And it's
Right.
not change that comes without a really practical CEO that gets it.
So speaking of change, I don't know baseball well enough to come up with an analogy, so I'm going to use a football analogy. But
Works.
everyone sees games on Sunday, and then Monday is film day. So they're watching films about what they did to extract what they did right, what they did wrong, what they need to do differently. They're watching films of the other team to understand how they need to adapt. And my experience is that most sales coaching is like film day, and film day is over, and then everyone goes back into the field of sales or shows up for a team meeting to catch the flight on Saturday for the game on Sunday with nothing in between. But of course, that doesn't work. The football team takes the film learnings and then they map it on the whiteboard with the X's and O's, and then they go out on the field and they walk through it, and then they run through it, and then they do it until they get it right and where it's second nature. And to me, that's coaching and role playing that's completely missing for most sales managers. Somehow they think just watching the films fixes it.
Yeah, you nailed it, Ed, because what you just described is a conversation where we say, what did we do right? What did we do wrong? What did we need to do better? How can we do it better? What are the lessons learned? What are we going to do next? And let's practice that. And that almost never happens in sales. We're lucky if there's even a conversation
Right.
where a sales manager says, "So, Ed, how did it go?" "It went great." "Oh, good, 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 good."
Do you need my
If
help
they're
getting
going to
the
ask a
quote done?
lame, yeah, if they're going to ask a lame "How did it go?" question, can we at least follow it up by challenging them and saying, "Well, why do you think it went well?"
Right.
On a 0 to 10 scale, with 0 being it was totally transactional and 10 being it was highly consultative, what would you give the number? And why would you give it that number? And okay, you said 6. So what would you have had to do differently to get to 10? Even at that elementary basis, at least some coaching is taking place other than how did it go? And are we
Right.
going to close it?
Right. Yeah, but the other piece of it is the role playing to lock it in. The discussion is helpful, and you point out it happens too rarely, but the role playing is critical. And if we use the baseball analogy, I mean, nobody got really good without spending time in the weight room and without spending time in the batting cage. If we use music, nobody got good without playing their scales routinely as part of every session. And the idea that salespeople have the latitude to say, I don't think role playing helps very much. We're not going to do it. I mean, that comes back to this lack of accountability.
There's two things that come to mind. One, using the baseball analogy. Several years ago, I wrote an article based on a video that was going around online of a live recorded pitcher's fielding practice where the coach was just pounding grounders back at the pitchers. And these were all-star pitchers. And the pitchers were just watching batted ball after batted ball after batted ball. They sucked. So what's the coach's response? Let's do it again. And he just kept pounding these balls at him and just kept going on and on and on. And part of that is fielding the ball. Part of that's throwing the ball over to first. Part of that is covering first base. The sales equivalent to that is role play. Let's role play. And if it didn't go well, let's do it again and do it
Right,
every day. This isn't a one and done. It's not an event. It's daily skills development.
right,
And sales managers need to be able to step into either the buyer role or the seller role and make it sound effortless and be able to demonstrate to salespeople this is what good sounds like. Because
right.
most salespeople don't know what good sounds like. The second thing that came to mind is a scene from the movie Hitch, where Will Smith uh, role plays with Kevin James what it's gonna be like when he brings Allegra Cole home after the first date, and he's role playing the first kiss, and Kevin James won't do the role play because it's too uncomfortable for him to think about kissing Allegra and to do it with Will Smith and actually, pretend to be romantic with Will Smith. And that's how salespeople feel about role playing. It's too uncomfortable. I can't imagine doing it. I can't play that part. They can they play the part of the prospect badly. They play the part of the salesperson pathetically.
Right. Well, it comes back to you said early on, willingness to be uncomfortable, and they're not willing to be uncomfortable. So you can't possibly grow.
Great job circling back to where we started from.
Well, I get so many more questions that I want to ask you, but we're quickly running out of time, so I got to be judicious here. Let's talk about your system that you wrote the book Baseline Selling around.
Okay,
As I understand the way you describe it, it's unique in that it integrates sales methodology and sales process. And those I think are often conflated terms, but talk us through that.
sure. Um, there are sales processes out there, and almost all of them are either horribly oversimple, there just aren't enough steps or milestones or stages, or severely overcomplicated. It looks like uh, a blueprint or a electronic flowchart,
Right.
or just with all kinds of zigzags and just 127 different things that happen. And selling needs to be somewhere between 4 and 6 stages. A stage being like discovery, qualification, presentation, close. Those are stages, but
Right.
those aren't milestones. Milestones are the key achievements that have to happen within a stage in order to move the process along. And whether the process is overly simplified and it's missing all the discovery milestones and all the qualification milestones, as most of them are, you know, most of the simple sales processes I've reviewed for companies look more like walking into a car showroom, meet, greet, qualified, demo, and the emphasis is on demo. Um, a lot has to happen before we can justify, presenting or doing a demo. And software sales is worse than car sales. It's just schedule people for demos. And what
Yep.
happens then? Whoever they got to attend the demo, which is always the wrong person, says, "Oh, that's nice." Not, "We gotta have that."
Right.
No, that's nice. And since they're not getting them to, "We gotta have that," they don't have a compelling reason to get a decision maker involved. They don't have a compelling reason to go ask for the money. And that's why software companies typically close less than 10% of their opportunities because everything's stuck in the pipeline and not moving.
Right.
Um, so there's this sense that process wise, there's a logic, practical framework that has to be in place where the process builds upon itself. You don't do this step unless you've created the ammunition to execute that step. At the
Right.
same time, you need methodology to help you move from milestone to milestone to milestone and from stage to stage to stage. And they can't be two disjointed things. Like you're in the machine world, you can't put this component that was designed for machine A onto machine X. They're not interchangeable. So there needs to be a holistic interaction and synergy between process and methodology. So methodology is what the conversation sounds like to move the process forward. At the same time, there's a third component, and that's the pipeline. And the sales process has to be consistent with and integrated with the pipeline as it's sitting in a company's CRM application. And
So
those
you
three
mean they
things
shouldn't
are,
just use however the CRM comes with the stages in the pipeline out of the box?
that's what most companies do. And it's
Yep.
just stupid. And of course, salespeople aren't using it anyhow because
Right.
the company picked the wrong CRM application, and it just
One of the most
doesn't help.
powerful one of the most powerful images of baseline selling is the idea that a sales rep finds pain. Call that when they're getting to first base. They find pain. Somebody says, "Oh yeah, that's not as good as it could be," and so then they take off running. Maybe dodge the mound, but heading straight over to third base and get ready to solve it with a proposal and a quote. completely missing everything that has to happen on their way to second, rounding second, tagging second, and going to third. And then, these deals end up just kind of sitting there. They sit in this distended pipeline that gets bigger and bigger. When's that going to close? Oh, next week, next month, next quarter. Always going to close, but it doesn't because they haven't done the basic stuff along the way. So I love that visual of the baseball diamond. Everyone chuckles about how asinine it is to run from first to third. And then they kind of, there's a sheepish grin on their faces. They realize that's exactly what their sales team does every time they hear pain.
Earlier in our conversation, you asked me about that combination of baseball and sales.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked about how great it was to be able to combine two passions. But the baseball diamond was the greatest visual analogy to be able to show and demonstrate what salespeople do wrong. So, reaching first base, that's a first meeting. And third base is when you've got a good quality prospect who's been thoroughly qualified. So what you're describing is skipping the discovery that would take place between first and second, and skipping the qualification that takes place between second and third, and literally
Right,
running from first base to third base and trying to close without having covered all the stuff that supports closing.
right.
There is no better way of showing that visually than on the baseball diamond, which was the original concept that led to the book and the training and the curriculum.
When you and I met back in 92 and around that era,
Back
companies
in
invested
1992,
companies invested in training. I mean, HP and IBM and Xerox, those companies were known for year-long universities. And even, I would say, regular companies almost always had training, and people would spend weeks out of the year and consistent training activities on a regular basis. And now there's so little of it. What changed? How did companies lose sight of the importance of training?
great question. And I don't think they've stopped doing training. I think the companies have also taken the path of least resistance, and they've fallen victim to the sales enablement department's belief that if you provide the sales teams with the right tools, that will lead to sales success. They've fallen victim to marketing's beliefs that if you do the right inbound marketing to generate the leads, that the deals are sold before they come to us. And that was the myth that led to the buyer journey, that when you first talk to a prospect, they're 57% along the way. So those, more than anything else, I believe those two things have led to companies placing less of an emphasis on training and coaching up their salespeople, and more of a reliance that tools will accomplish the same thing, which, of course, the only thing those tools do, and I'm not saying that tools aren't important, but we shouldn't place unrealistic expectations on the tools. Do we need CRM? Yes. Do we need inbound? Yes. Do we need some of the other intelligence tools? Yes. But they don't sell for us, they
Right.
just help us. Uh, so yeah, when they start getting real about what those tools represent, and whether or not they actually lead to an increase in revenue, if we can ever get people there, then there'll be a return to let's invest in our people, because it's our people that do the selling, not the tools.
But if the kind of prevalent attitude is that these other tools will take care of it and they don't invest in sales training, it feels to me a huge opportunity for competitive differentiation for the few companies that do take it seriously.
That's right, and there is. The companies that we work with are pretty much able to very quickly grow their revenue and outsell all their competition because they're focused on the right stuff. They're focused on how can I get better at getting people to meet with us, at getting people to take us seriously, at getting people to see us as the experts, at getting people to spend more money to do business with us and to do it quickly and to continue doing it with us. So the companies that do invest in training and coaching and sales process customization, they see immediate returns on those investments of money and time.
And is sales training something a couple days at an annual sales kickoff meeting, or is it something that they have to engage in for 2 years? Is it somewhere in between? I think there's not a lot of clarity, but there's an expectation, like with most things in society, that there's you snap your fingers and somehow something can happen very quickly.
Yeah. So as we've mentioned already, I've been at this for almost 40 years. And some things have changed and some things haven't. The way we sell has changed for the better, but the way people are selling hasn't changed as quickly. So that's the need for the training. The tools that are available are impressive and they support us in selling, but they haven't replaced selling. The vehicle for training, what we train, how often we train, how long we train has changed dramatically. You know,
Online or in person.
yeah, the blended learning works the best. A combination of live, in person, live, virtual, and online self-directed. But
Hmm.
online self-directed by itself doesn't train anybody.
Right.
It's got to be part of something. It either
It's like film
supports
day.
the live training or live coaching supports the online
Right.
self-directed learning. Um, we're no longer in the days of doing, 1 and 2 day seminars for the most part, because that never worked. So what a lot of folks learned in pandemic times is that doing short, frequent 1 to 2 hour training sessions was pretty powerful because you weren't overwhelming anybody with information and you had a couple of weeks for them to go out and do what they just learned. We've been doing it that way for 15 years. So we didn't change anything during the pandemic. It was what we'd been doing.
Right.
And so blended learning, a couple times a month, 12 to 18 months, focus on sales process, sales milestones, sales competencies, role play the stuff that they need to role play so that they can develop some muscle memory about applying that stuff and using that stuff. Spend some time on the right messaging and the value that they offer, and you get a kick ass sales team by the time you're done,
And
especially if
what?
you've also trained sales managers to coach to that.
Sure. What about the flash to bang time? Obviously, the sales team evaluation will help you understand the raw material you're working with, the friction that's going to be involved, and that what percentage of them actually could possibly achieve improvement. But assuming kind of an average scenario, you're saying 18 months to achieve excellence and build the muscle and be at a maintenance point with good coaching. How long until they start to see some impact?
That's going to change or vary by company because it's totally dependent on the length of their sales cycle. So if we've got a company with a 12-month sales cycle, a long sales cycle, they're not going to see any results for at least 12 months
They
because
won't see revenue, but they might well see more new logo meetings.
that's true. But if we say the stuff that's already in their pipeline has already been sold the wrong way and that we're
Right.
not going to be able to impact that stuff very
Right.
much, then what we're really impacting are the new opportunities they bring into the pipeline. And if those aren't going to close for 12 months, even if we can shorten their sales cycle and get it down to 8 months, it's still probably going to be a year before they can see
Sure.
the revenue impact. But by month 3, you should be seeing major changes in the number of new meetings they're booking, the quality of the meetings they're booking, the value of the meetings they're booking, and you should see changes in the quality of the conversations they're having with those opportunities. So there are things we can measure along the way, but revenue is deferred.
Makes sense. How about independent directors on a board who understand revenue growth? Is that too disconnected, or do you think that's important in order to provide the appropriate oversight of the executive leadership team?
The board can, members of the board can be involved, can be driving the initiative. That's a good thing. It's never a bad thing. Even if they don't support it, that's a good thing because that puts more pressure on the CEO or the CRO or the senior VP of sales to make it work. So, and any engagement from the CEO to the board makes it work better. And it's important that a CEO be visible throughout this process, because you don't want the sales team thinking, here comes the flavor of the month, or
Right.
this isn't going to last. It's just going to die and go away. A visible CEO showing their commitment to this initiative, showing that it's important, showing that they're not trying it out, but this is
Right.
the way forward, changes the attitude and the mindset of the people in the training from day one.
Should, depending on the size of the company, should the CEO or the president or the GM or some senior leadership person be participating in training alongside with them?
Absolutely.
I am reconnecting with Dave Kurlan after we had a technical screw up that interfered with our completing the recording last time. So you'll see it's several weeks or maybe even months later. We probably look different. Dave's looking great. He's looking relaxed, and so anyway, that's why you see things a little bit differently suddenly as we're partway through this recording. But I wanted to make sure that I reconnected with Dave to get his take on a couple final questions that are really important. And the one we're going to start with is, with all of the changes in sales, with everything that's changed about buying habits and selling behaviors, obviously we got to talk about AI. I mean, I had a guy on the podcast recently who is a machine learning expert, and he suggests from his mechanical engineer perspective that he believes he can disintermediate salespeople because he gets no value from most of them. So what's your take? How is AI going to change sales?
Well, first of all, I have more than one take. This is a
Okay.
multi-take. So I used AI earlier today to finish up an article I was writing. I couldn't find the image I wanted, and I asked AI to create the image. And after a few fails, like horses with 3 legs and horses with 5 legs and horses in the sleigh instead of the children in the sleigh, I finally got the image I wanted. So, I find, but that's not selling.
Right.
That's marketing. Um, I posted on LinkedIn this morning and I clicked rewrite with AI, and it came up with
I've
something
never
that was
tried
pretty
that.
good, but I liked what
Do you
I
do
had
that
better.
normally?
But I can use AI for that. I was under a deadline for Top Sales Magazine. I'm a monthly contributor to that. So I asked AI to write an article using my voice, and I taught it what my voice was by having it read a dozen of my articles, and asked it to write a new article on this topic with this theme, and it did. And all I had to do was make some edits, and it sounded like me, and it sounded like what I would have written. I got arrangements created for 2 new country songs I wrote, my only country songs. And it came out exactly the way I wanted, including vocals. I love AI,
I feel like there's a butt coming.
but, but AI cannot replace salespeople. AI can support salespeople. AI can do some of the automation and some of the summarizing, but the conversation that must take place between a seller and a buyer cannot be done by AI. Even highly sophisticated AI cannot have that conversation, which must be human based. And while the person you just talked about, who prefers to avoid salespeople, would prefer a bot, um, maybe on a low price transaction, but if it's a complex sale and we're talking about spending tens or hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, that needs to be a human. So some jobs may be obsoleted out to AI that are largely transactional, that where people can actually do without salespeople. In much the same way the travel industry got automated out to the web. But for most B2B sales, where it's a complex sale, a long sales cycle, competition, price sensitive nature, a story to tell, you're an underdog, You don't want some bot doing that for you, no matter how well trained and how sophisticated that bot is, because it's
All right, so
still
that
a
makes sense.
bot.
However, one of the things that you make me acutely aware of is that sales talent follows a distribution curve like everything else in nature. And so certainly, if we get out to the right end of the tail, great salespeople will continue to add value. On the other hand, in the middle, where they're not adding a ton of value, which is what frustrates a guy like this engineer that I was talking to, then, I mean, is there a place for them or are they going to be obviated?
Yes, it depends on the company. I'm thinking a modern, technically savvy company might say, "Hey, what do we have to lose? Our salespeople suck anyhow and don't provide any value. Let's try some of this new AI, and we'll let our customers decide whether they're okay with that." I don't think they will be, but they can try. Um, and some of the old school industries, like manufacturing and distribution and building materials, the industries that have been really slow even to
Right.
move to CRM. They're not going there, not until they sell their businesses to some young tech
Okay.
savvy person.
All right. Now, another kind of related question is the role of marketing compared to sales. There's a lot of research that shows that buyers don't want to talk to salespeople until they're 70% of the way through their buying journey. Now, of course, that's once the buyer decides that they're going to do something. And great salespeople can go in much earlier and create a project through consultative selling and that sort of thing. But how do you think? I mean, you've done a ton of marketing for years. You've got a ton of blog articles, which are really marketing in many ways, but they're also sales enablement. But how do you view that relationship between marketing and selling changing?
Well, I think first, before I answer the question, we need to put a scientific definition of both sales and
Good.
marketing on the table so that everybody
Okay.
knows where we're coming from. So, marketing is everything that happens prior to the first actual conversation, and selling is everything that happens starting with the first
Okay.
actual conversation. So, as long as we're on the same page with those two definitions, then um, I don't think there's going to be any overlap. Yeah, I market, but it's different from
Right.
my sales function. And I sell, and that's different from
Would
my
you agree with
marketing
my premise
function.
that the idea?
And people who don't want to talk to salespeople until they're 57% or 77%, they don't want to talk
Right.
to crappy salespeople. If the person they're talking to is listening and asking great questions and helping them come to a new way of thinking and a new way of understanding their situation or a new perspective on how they do things, they'll have no problem in the world talking to somebody if they're 0% or 10% or 20%, or if they're minus 10%, they haven't even thought
Right.
about doing this yet, but they could be 100% and still not want to talk to a
Right.
crappy salesperson. And if their experience is that every time they get on the phone with a salesperson, they're crappy and they add no value, then nothing's
Right.
going to change
That
that.
makes sense. All right. Aside from your blog, and I'll drop the link to that in the show notes, and your book, Baseline Selling, which I'll also link in the show notes. What resources do you recommend for executives who want to understand more about the science of sales?
I think the blog and the book do it all.
Okay. All right. And if folks want to reach you because they're interested in learning more about your sales training programs, what's the best way for them to do that?
Email works. Dave Kurlan at kurlanassociates.com.
Good.
And by the way, the blog, everybody's got their own perception of what a blog is. Um, Mine's a little different. I've written 2,000 articles on there. Most of the articles are backed by data and science. Almost every article is based on some wacko analogy that my head came up with. So it's different than the useless drivel that most people associate with a blog. And it would be 8 different books if I had time to write a book, or 8 more books, but I don't.
So analogies, a lot around baseball, some around your dog Digger, some around yard work and landscaping and masonry and other things like that. And
Fine.
recently, you've kind of touched the third rail, talking more about politics and religion as well.
Yeah. I think Wednesday, my fourth installment on the biblical sales force comes out. And this will be an article on numbers and accountability. Because 5,000 years ago, God was holding Moses and the Israelites accountable, and the consequences was death.
Well, death.
Most sales leaders don't have to hold anybody accountable to a consequence of death. So sales leadership should be pretty easy in comparison,
Yeah, just some accountability would be such a refreshing change today. There seems to be
wouldn't
such
it?
a dearth of accountability across the board.
Yeah, and I list 25 areas where they can hold salespeople accountable. So it's more than revenue and quota. But by the time this video comes out, that article will probably be a month in the rearview mirror. So you'll have to go
And
back
maybe
and
some
find it in the archive.
unsubscribes that or some angry comments that you'd have, but I think your need for approval is low enough that you're okay with that.
Yeah, I'll take the unsubscribed. I'd rather write for people who want to read it.
There you go. All right, so we spoke for about an hour last time. We've spoken for 8 or 10 minutes this time. Um, I want to ask you to recap. Now, I'd hesitate with many people because our last conversation is a while ago. However, we talked about the
3 months
things
ago.
we talk about the things you talk about all the time. So sales cycles are longer, close rates are lower, more reps are missing quota, more deals evaporate in no decision, accountability is lacking. So, as a sales training expert, what would you say, kind of put a bow on it with a couple minutes, what should executives understand about the next 5 years and the decisions that they face today and in the near future around their sales teams?
First of all, I think taking the obvious, we're going to be in the Trump economy. So it's a great environment for doing business. So this is the time to invest. This is the time to realistically think about growth, to raise expectations. But it can't just be you raising the expectations and thinking about growth. You've got to bring the salespeople along with those higher expectations. So you need to train, 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 and coach, coach, coach.
And role
And
play,
that
role play, role play.
role play, role play, role play. And that's all in the context of sales process and sales methodology. So you get that part done right, and then the rest of it kind of falls into place.
Cool. It's been a fabulous conversation, both parts of the conversation, Dave. Thank you for sharing your years of experience and insights with me.
Thanks for having me. It was fun. You asked great questions, and it was a really good interview.
That's kind of you to say. All right, quick shout out to everybody who's watching and listening. Thanks for spending time with Dave and me. A reminder, obviously, I need you to do your part. Dave showed up and dropped a lot of wisdom, but you need to drop a comment and a like and a share. And by all means, please subscribe to the podcast on your favorite channel as well. Thanks for joining me and Dave for the Industrial Growth Institute podcast.